So good evening, everybody. It's really an honor to be here to share my work with you. And before I get started, I want to thank Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy, their board, and their board chair, who unfortunately can't make it this evening, Lindsey Milstein, for their support. I also want to thank the speakers on our panel tonight who helped inform this work. This work would not be here if it weren't for them in so many ways. It just wouldn't have the quality that's it ended up with. And finally, I'd like to thank the Writers Center and the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities for making this evening possible. Tonight, I will tell you about how I literally stumbled onto these ferns, how I was charmed by them, how I create them, and why I felt they needed to be so big. You might ask, why ferns? I mean, really, there are lots of things out there, but why ferns? Well, in the quirky sort of way that life unfolds itself, we are here tonight because several years ago, I went for a hike in Rock Creek Park and accidentally stepped on a cluster of Christmas ferns. I felt ashamed of my carelessness and stopped to look more closely at the damage I caused. As I bent down to look at the damage, a miniature fern forest with a few broken stalks appeared. I was astounded. This mystical moment passed by in a flash, but it inspired me to create a larger version of the ferns facing me. I wanted to convey the importance of the often overlooked world at our feet. I kept thinking, we as humans may be bigger, but we can't afford to gloss over these smaller species. All life on Earth, no matter what size, is governed by the laws of species interdependency. In this respect, ferns are our partners. They have much to teach us. And according to the American Fern Society, ferns are one of the oldest groups of plants on the Earth, with a fossil record dating back to Middle Devonian, 383 to 393 million years ago. Ferns are survivors, and I was not sure how to communicate all this in my work, but I knew from the get-go that I wanted people to look up at these ancient plants with curiosity. To do this, the ferns needed to be as big as we are. As I began making these ferns, I found large clusters of them in the lush understory of Dumbarton Oaks Park. With field guides in hand and the help of botanists like Ann Aldrich from Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy and Anna Tulkin from the National Park Service, who we are honored to have with us tonight, I began to identify the ferns. A few years later, as the Conservancy's artist in residence, I began investigating the ferns more vigorously, studying planting lists, National Park Service vascular plant surveys, and the cultural landscape report of the park. I also examined fern specimens at the Smithsonian's National Herbarium, located in the Natural History Museum, which holds the largest collection of ferns in the world. There, I consulted with their research botanist, Eric Schuettpelz, and staff illustrator, Alice Tangerini, both of whom I'm also delighted to have here tonight. Eventually, I documented 16 fern species in the park. Then, one by one, I created them, 11 of which were selected for this exhibit. And by the way, they are all native ferns, except for the imposter. All of this was because I went hiking Crazy, right? I never thought I would say this, but watch out when you go for a hike and step on a fern. It might just change your life. Many people ask, how long does it take to make these ferns? and how do you make them anyway? Well, the process of creating each fern is complex and time-consuming. Each one takes roughly 6 months or more to create. And how do I make them? Well, as you can see, each fern is unique. But I generally use the same process for each one. And I'm going to try to go through that process right now. Each one, like I said, is a little different, but this is sort of the general order. I begin each piece finding it in the woods. Not easy, they don't give you their address, right? Then I identify the ferns, which is also really not easy and super complicated in certain times. And then I photograph it. That's probably the easiest part. I then enlarge these photographs to see the details of the ferns without a microscope. I then draw the fern to scale, 7 to 10 times its original size, on a piece of Dacron, and I cut it out. With my sewing machine, I then sew the cutout parts together and insert copper wire along the stalks and into the leaflets. This supports the architectural part of the fern. Then, using tiny surgical scissors, I then very carefully shape the outer edges of the leaflets to define them. The leaflets are then sewn onto the stalk using a pair of pliers and a really heavy-duty upholstery needle. So at that point, the fern is, structurally, it's pretty much completed, but it's all white. I then paint the fern with many layers of translucent acrylic paint and use colored pencils to define the veination in the leaves. In the lighter leaves in these ferns, you can see the veination. The darker leaves, not so easy. Finally, I mount the ferns on a large canvas painted with the impression of cherry blossoms. The cherry blossoms are a nod to the cherry trees that grow uphill from where I found many of these ferns in Dumbarton Oaks Park. It's also a nod to the overstory and to DC in general. And now it's time to hear from our panel. Our panelists are a really important part of this evening, not just because they were central to informing this body of work, but because their work is part of a greater and very, very important effort to support our environment. And now, without further ado, it is an honor for me to introduce them to you. The first person I would like to introduce is Anna Tulkin. Anna serves as a botanist in Rock Creek Park, which is part of the National Park Service. She specializes in invasive plant management and has been actively involved in the years-long effort to restore Dumbarton Oaks Park through the partnership between Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy and Rock Creek Park. As many of you may know, the park was so overrun with invasive plants that the native plants were being choked. The ferns Beatrix Ferrand planted in the park over 100 years ago are thrilled this park is being restored because they can finally breathe. Anna also played a major role in helping me to identify the fern specimens for this exhibit. Identifying ferns is not an easy task. That is why one of the ferns in this exhibit is labeled an imposter. Tonight, we are honored to have Anna talk to us about the importance of restoring cultural landscapes. Please welcome Anna.
Thank you.
Do you think you could come up here?
Okay.
That way we can see you on the camera we are recording this evening. Thanks. We'll use those for question and answers.
Great. Thank you, Sophia, for such an incredible history and review of all your work with Ferns. Thank you for having me tonight. And I'm delighted to be here and to share the work that MPS and Rock Creek Park has done alongside with the Dumbarton Oaks Conservancy and volunteers and with your artwork. Sophia asked me to talk a little bit about cultural landscapes, and I would like to put us into context of what a cultural landscape is. It is basically an area that is supposed to be taken care and protected as it was originally created or intended at a certain time in history, potentially at the most important time in history for that area. It is a resource. It is a cultural resource for MPS. In this case, Dumbarton Oaks Park, the almost 30-acre park, it is our cultural landscape. We identify it and we are required to protect it. The cultural landscape report that has been created for that park gives us a really important historical context and gives us the idea that the Blisses, the original owners of the area, had for this area, alongside with the eyes of Beatrix Ferran, the cultural landscape architect that put not only their ideas on paper but on the ground and created this beautiful naturalistic garden. The cultural landscape report also talks that in the late 1900s, early 2000s, the area was getting really threatened by non-native invasive plant species, otherwise known as exotics, as weeds. And it was for the biggest interest of the park, it was the most important thing to remove them and to manage them using different methods. Luckily, that's in the early 2010s, that's when the park started a really great friendship, a partnership with the Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy. Our friends from the Conservancy helped us on the ground, changing the park from really massive infestations to being less infested. And therefore, the main goal was for the protection of those native species that Beatrix Ferran herself had planted in the late 30s, early 40s. The most important player in all of this work has been the volunteer. It hasn't been MPS employees, although they worked really hard. It has been the volunteers, people that put their boots on the ground, and we are eternally helpful for their work. Alongside with volunteers in the field, it has been the masterminds of the subject matter expertise. I'm speaking about the Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy Board and all the effort that they put to design all of these battle and to win this battle. And other experts like Sophia and their special interest, which we'll be talking about in a minute. As we were saving these natives, we especially took important notice of the ferns that were planted there and that existed in multiple quantities. Sensitive fern, Christmas ferns, ostrich ferns, etc. were saved. And along the time, as we know, we have the scientific community has helped us to clarify that ferns contribute a great deal to ecological processes. They are not only habitat, but they really look good. They are really aesthetically pleasing. They can serve as erosion control. They grow in shade, which it's something that park managers always look for ideas of something that can grow in shade. And they filter toxins, etc. So we were, I think that was one of the goals that has been achieved, and it's currently also being achieved as we improve the area all around there. But I think the other really good important point, and I think where Sophia has helped us bridge the gap between the idea of the Blizzes and the work in the field nowadays, is that the Blizzes had a really good artistic heart. They designed the park with the idea of not only having statues or artistic ideas within the park, but also to be the inspiration for art. And I think that's where Sophia comes from, and that's where you have brought the Blizzes and Beatrix Ferrand's legacy to the next step, to the 21st century, into not only going extremely on detail about all of these species, but make sure that you teach and show those species to all. And I think that is going back the circle. That is what the mission of the Park Service is, protecting and conserving for the benefit of all. And I really would like to thank you for that, for bringing that special puzzle piece and put it together, as well as a really big thank you to all volunteers that I see some that I recognize tonight, including the Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And now, to take a sip of water or I won't be able to talk. And now I'm happy to introduce Dr. Eric Schuettpelz. Eric, often referred to as the Fern Doctor, is a world-renowned research botanist. He is also the acting chair of the Department of Botany at the Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian on the Mall. His work focuses on the evolution and diversification of epiphytic ferns. He is the fern expert at the Smithsonian. Eric guided me through the fern collection at the National Herbarium, which has the largest collection of ferns in the world. He drew my attention to specific details, pointing out things I easily would have missed, like how the first sequence of the veins in the sensitive fern run parallel to the stem of the pinna. Definitely would have missed that. He also encouraged me to study ferns by looking at them under the department's microscopes so that I could portray them more accurately. I confess, using the microscopes in this way was the most scientific fun I might have ever had in my life. It's really awesome. So tonight, we are honored to have Eric talk with us about the history of ferns and their relevance to us today. And here comes some fern wisdom.
So lose the mask. Can everyone hear me all right? All right. So as a curator of ferns at the National Museum of Natural History, I'm responsible for a collection of more than 250,000 specimens. All of these specimens were collected from the wild. They were pressed, they were dried, they're mounted on large sheets of archival paper, and then they're filed in a sequence, a phylogenetic sequence that allows us to retrieve them, right, so that we can find what we're looking for. Some of these were collected in the last few years. Some of these were collected hundreds of years ago. All of them have scientific value, which is pretty incredible. As someone who spent the last 2 decades working on ferns, it brings me a lot of joy to join you all this evening to talk about these amazing plants. And so in the theme of if ferns could talk, I suppose they'd first let you know, as Sophia suggested, that they've been around a long time. They originated in the Paleozoic some 400 million years ago. That's a long time ago. That was before the supercontinent Pangaea even came together, much less split apart, way before the rise of dinosaurs. But if ferns could talk, I suspect they'd also mention and emphasize the fact that they're not living fossils. There are some exceptions. There are some exceptionally old species, but most of the fern diversity that we have on our planet today, some 12,000 species, are only hundreds of thousands or a few millions of years old on average. Most ferns are much younger than this deep date in time. So while the lineage is incredibly old, ferns as a lineage are incredibly old. The species that are with us today are actually quite young, originating well after the demise of dinosaurs. I suspect ferns might also emphasize the fact that despite where we find them when we're looking in our forests in our local area, that they don't all hang out on forest floors, right? So that when we think of a fern in the DC area and in the East Coast in general, we think of ferns as living on the forest floor, shady places. And that is spot on. They like those places. But ferns also like little rock crevices in the middle of the desert. Some ferns like to float in lakes. And of course, some ferns, as you mentioned, grow as epiphytes. So an epiphyte is simply a plant that grows on another plant. Ferns, about a third of their species grow living on other plants. Where are these plants? These plants are in the tropics. These are tropical rainforest trees. And when we think about young species, all of those species that inhabit these trees in tropical rainforest are of course younger than those rainforests themselves, right? Because there was no place for them to grow until those rainforests were established. If ferns could talk, I suspect they'd also let you know that they really get around. As you probably are aware, ferns don't produce by seeds, but instead make spores. These are tiny, tiny little propagules, about 1/20th of a millimeter in size typically. Dispersed by wind, capable of traveling incredibly long distances. So when you think about those 12,000 fern species, which is a lot of species, it's actually only a small proportion of global plant diversity. It's only about 4% of plants on Earth. But if you go to an island in the middle of the Pacific, for example, in some islands, ferns can actually represent 40% of the species that grow on those islands, a testament to just how well they are at getting around our planet. I could go on, but I won't. Suffice it to say that there is a lot more to fern diversity and ferns in general than meets the eye. And of course, those of us who study ferns, we have to pay attention to the details, but I think it's easy for the casual observer just to ignore them, right? Yeah, there's a fern, and yep, there's a fern, and there's only one fern, right? It's the fern. Of course, there are many ferns, and they have incredible details. And what I personally find most exciting about Sophia's art is that it captures those details, right? She talked about venation. She talked about specific venation. You look at how and where the spores are produced on the plants, how the leaves are dissected. Capturing those details are really key to understanding fern diversity, and this artwork really goes a long way in making these details and ferns in general accessible to everyone, and that's what really excites me about your work. Sophia's time spent observing ferns under the microscope and then meticulously creating these works of art has really paid incredible dividends, I think, for anyone who's interested in the natural world. And I'm really thrilled to be here tonight to celebrate your accomplishments and ferns with you all today. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. And now I would like to introduce Jeannie Braha. Jeannie is the Executive Director of Rock Creek Park Conservancy She has been deeply involved with environmental issues in the DC area for over a decade. Rock Creek Park has greatly benefited from her efforts to begin restoring its parklands as a natural oasis, specifically through her mini oasis restoration program. Under this initiative, specific sites have been set up across the park for the regeneration of the understory shrubs and herbaceous plants. While regeneration takes time, the progress they have made is impressive. Through Jeannie, I have learned a tremendous amount about the understory where these ferns and other plants create shelter for the animals who live in the park. Tonight, we are honored to have Jeannie speak to us about the importance of habitat.
Thank you so much, Sophia. It's really a pleasure to finally be here and to see the work up on the walls. I actually got a chance to see at the opening as well, but it's really, I think it's brighter today. It is just remarkable to see and soak it all in. You asked me to speak about habitat, but I'm going to take a slight creative liberty, and habitat is really home, right, for all of the wildlife and the plants that live in a habitat. We all have our own habitats as well. And since we're in the Writer Center, someone who I think got her start here, Melanie Chukas-Bradley, who's a local naturalist and writer, she writes often of this concept of finding one's wild home. And Sophia, I think you have taken that concept of finding one's wild home to perhaps an extreme that most of us do not. But the idea of a wild home is finding that special place in the natural world that you can call and perhaps consider your own. We've certainly seen many people, not just the amazing volunteers. It's really not my mini oasis program. It's Anna's and Julia's and the all our volunteers mini oasis program. But it's the volunteers, but also the people that visit the park and that special spot that they walk with their dog on a leash on the regular, or take note, on a leash. Or the spot that, I used to take my son to throw rocks into the creek, kind of every weekend morning, or he maybe should have been on a leash from time to time, but he's survived. But those places that you go back to again and again, and when you do that, you start to see the little details, all the many different layers of whether it's the forest and the understory, usually not quite as detailed as you have, Sophia. But we've really started to see people gain a deeper appreciation. Most people recognize that quality of life benefit that Rock Creek offers us, a cool place to take a walk, a meditative spot to soothe your soul. But they're starting to see the forest for the trees and the ferns for the understory, if you will. And part of what people are seeing is not just the plants and the things that stay still. They do tend to be easier to identify. They might not have addresses, but they're in the same place usually when you come back a couple of times in a row. But the turtle that's nibbling on it, or the fox that's darting around the corner, and that biodiversity, which is, what really makes our planet livable and makes our home habitable. And it takes amazing artwork like this, I think, to bring that idea to a broader audience. But I am so excited to see and facilitate so many of you and our neighbors doing that in Rock Creek. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Anna Tulkin of the Mini Oases. Anna is
Thank you.
a tremendous resource to our understanding of the techniques that we use to help restore the forest and the way that we manage volunteers in there. So thank you, Sophia, for this opportunity to talk about habitat and home.
Thank you, Jeannie. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Paula Posa. Paula is the Deputy Director of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club. She has over 15 years of experience addressing environmental issues and is currently working to prevent the proposed expansion of 495 and 270. If Ferns could talk, they would not be big fans of this highway expansion. This is because when we drive our cars, the fossil fuels we use contains fossilized ferns and other plants from over 300,000 years, a million years ago. The ferns would also be upset because the expansion would destroy tens of parks and streams where they live. Yep, the ferns would say we can't keep doing this. Tonight, we are honored to have Paula speak to us about the importance of stewardship beyond the park. Please welcome Paula.
Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see all of your faces here. So I'm the Deputy Director of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, and I first want to thank Sophia for this beautiful evening and for all of the speakers who are speaking, and to all of you for listening and participating and enjoying this beautiful time. So Sierra Club is our country's oldest, largest grassroots environmental organization, founded in 1892. And our motto is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet so that we can have clean air, clean water, and natural spaces for all Marylanders to enjoy, all people, but for us, all Marylanders. And what I want to start out with is that Sierra Club really believes in the power of people to protect the environment. We believe that people power is essential to creating movements to protect the planet. And movements come from inspiration and passion and stepping on a sweet little fern colony. and that's where these things come from. They don't, they come from these moments of hiking or moments of experiencing something. And they come from the heart, not just the head. So art has a really critical role to play in awakening people to environmental protection, such as Sophia is doing with this exhibit and her beautiful art. Another well-known example of inspiration from art is Ansel Adams, whose photography helped play a key role in inspiration for the preservation of our national parks. And so we need that inspiration here in Maryland, and it's a joy to be a part of that. So this exhibit is a reminder of the beauty around us that we enjoy in Maryland, and it's a reminder of the urgency to protect our open spaces, our natural spaces. And this is something that every generation has to do again and again and again. And when the Beltway was put in, for example, Plummer's Island, which is this biodiversity oasis, this island near the bridge, had to be protected. And when you read the history, there were Supreme Court justices and people on the C&O Canal, and it was a whole people camping out, the biologists and the botanists. It was a huge thing that they kept the bridge off their island. And now we're having to do it again. And so it just falls to us at different times to arise in these moments. So I hope that art like this can inspire action as well as contemplation, because we have really big challenges ahead and really big opportunities. And this is the moment, it's really amazing that sometimes it just falls to the person in the place to arise to that moment. And I think all of us are, have that moment in our lives, hopefully many times, where we're called to arise and protect something. And I hope we can see the relevance of that. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that Maryland Sierra Club does in terms of converting passion and protection, into action, into, being inspired and then turning it into action. So one of the first things that Maryland Sierra Club is supporting is protecting our natural treasures and ensuring that more Marylanders can enjoy these natural spaces. So there's just been a legislation passed in the Maryland General Assembly called the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. And it's really exciting. It's to expand the park system and increase its accessibility to all Marylanders. But that's just the first step. And so we need to continue to urge our legislators and elected officials to put these ideas of the legislation into practice and to help support them and support that effort in Maryland. The second thing that I'm going to talk about briefly is the Beltway expansion. So as you know, Governor Hogan was planning to expand the Beltway, American Legion Bridge Beltway, and I-270 over to about the I-270 spurs for the first phase. And we are in Sierra Club are working to stop Governor Hogan's proposed expansion, and it threatens our natural places and our communities, and it will not work. It will not reduce congestion. It will not do that. And it may sound like it's moving forward in the ad, like it sounds exciting in the ads. Oh, we're going to get this great infrastructure and for free, and it's just not the case. So we need to keep awake, and we are going to be taking action against that effort, because we are going to be helping explain to the public what it actually means and what's at stake. So yeah, it will, I'll just mention that it will definitely mean a lot of destruction of green spaces and irreversible harm to communities, public health, and quality of life. So another issue of that is that it will lock in fossil fuel infrastructure at a greater degree, and the congestion will remain. There's high tolls, and it has equity issues in terms of differential harms to different people. So one thing that I can say is that, the Ferns can't talk, and neither can the Chesapeake Bay, or our climate, or our parks, or Plumbers Island. So it falls to us to do the talking and the advocacy, and we just have to do that. So I think this is one of those moments that's particularly acute in our history, where we are called to pay attention and to act as we can to support our natural places and our communities. So those are the two issues Sierra Club is working on that I'll mention. And I will say that it's important work and it's tough work, and it can sometimes be draining when you get 26,000 pages that you have to review in 30 days, as we have right now. But thankfully we have art and community and parks and other natural places to re-energize us and inspire us. And we look forward to your support in turning these important into the kind of advocacy that's needed, and in turning our awe and wonder for the natural world into action. So thank you very much, and thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Paula. And now, I am so happy to introduce our last speaker of the evening, Julia Washburn. Julia is the superintendent of Rock Creek Park, which is part of the National Park Service. She is also an adjunct professor at GW. You still?
Yes.
Just checking. Prior to becoming the superintendent, she was the associate director for the interpretation and education at National Park Service headquarters. In her role as superintendent, Julia oversees Rock Creek Park, as well as some of DC's most popular parks like Meridian Hill and Dumbarton Oaks Park. Under her leadership, arts programming in the park, such as art workshops and concerts, have expanded. I am grateful for her support of my work over the past 8 years, and am happy that she can join us this evening. Tonight, we are honored to have Julia speak to us about the power of place and why we need parks.
Thank you, Sophia. And thank you to all these panelists for all that you do. Anna, you are a treasure on the team at Rock Creek Park, and we love you. I'm so happy that someone devotes all of his time and attention to studying ferns and curating ferns. That is so important, right? It's critical. And of course, Jeannie, partner in crime with me, trying to, keep the park going and make it better, right? And Paula, we are downstream from the Beltway expansion, proposed Beltway expansion, and it goes right through the Rock Creek waters. And Rock Creek is named for Rock Creek Park is named for Rock Creek, right? What is it if we keep chipping away at the creek, at our streams, at our natural waterways? They're so important. So anyway, I'm just really excited to be here tonight, and you know how excited I am about your ferns. I'm like, every couple of months or so, I'm like, Sophia, can I come over for tea? I want to see the ferns. No, I actually was very, very excited when I started my tenure as superintendent at Rock Creek Park, and I talked to Lindsey Milstein, and she said, we have an artist in residence at Dumbarton Oaks Park. And I went, what a great thing. And you need to meet her. Her name is Sophia, and she makes these giant sculptures of ferns. So anyway, Sophia asked me to talk about the power of place. And really everyone here has been talking about the power of place. I just want to ask you for a minute to think about maybe a special spot that you had as a child. When you were a child, many of us did have interaction with nature, especially our generation, and often we did have like a special hidey hole place that was just ours. Is there anyone here who had something like that in their lives? I see a couple people going like this. Well, I would ask you to talk about it, but we only have a few minutes, right? But I certainly did as a child as well, and my special place was in Rock Creek Park. I lived right across the street from the park, and it was the place where I got strength, and I felt good about myself, and I felt awe, and I felt wonder. And when you go into Dumbarton Oaks Park, which I'm hopeful that everybody here has, and if you haven't, you need to, when you go into Dumbarton Oaks Park and you go to the lower gardens, Beatrix Ferrand, which Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy is so lovingly helping to restore and advocating for and mobilizing volunteers and raising money, and you go in there and you have the feeling of being in a secret place, like a secret garden. And it is a place where you can run into a little sweet patch of ferns, right? And it is a place where you can contemplate these beautifully restored meadows. And it's special. And you can't have that experience watching Netflix. You just cannot have it. You have to be in the place. But what the artist does, right, is the artist helps us see the place even better. In Sophia's ferns, she's really helping us to see Dumbarton Oaks Park, to really see who's there and what they're saying, if they could talk, and what they mean. And really understand how amazing they are and what miracles they are. I mean, these things have been around, not these specific ones, but these things have been around for 400 million years. I mean, that's incredible. And they are miracles. And on our watch, some of them might go extinct. And on our watch, they might be extirpated from Rock Creek Park. So we're not going to let that happen. So they can't speak, really. Paula said that to us, like they can't. They would have a lot to say, and we all know that they would have a lot to say if they could, but we have to speak for them. And it's our mission at Rock Creek Park to work with partners, and special partners like the Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy and the Rock Creek Park Conservancy, who we depend on, literally, to help us conserve and preserve and restore these amazing spaces. And I'm looking at Jane McLeish, and I just want to recognize her as one of the original founders of Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy. I've spoken to Jane in the past, and she talks about looking at it, when it was completely covered with vines, and you really couldn't get in there, and just saying, well, let's do it. Let's clean it up. We're going to do this. And if you looked at it, it was a Sisyphean task. But with the hard work and dedication of the Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy, combined with our National Park Service staff and other partners who are helping to preserve parks and restore parks, it's a totally different place. So at a time when the Park Service has this really important job of preserving and protecting our parks, and here in Washington, D.C., preserving and protecting Rock Creek Park and Dumbarton Oaks Park that are so critical. Can you imagine Washington, D.C. without Rock Creek Park? I mean, it wouldn't be livable, right? It's the lungs of our city. And it's the special place. It's the secret place, right? So we don't have enough money. I'll just be very, very blunt. And I will also say that these forests and these places are threatened. They're threatened by climate change very directly, and it's happening right now. And they're threatened, frankly, because of some ways they're being overused. But the real threat is if we don't work hard to conserve and protect them and plan for their future, we won't have these amazing places. We won't have them in 30 years or 50 years or 100 years. And Dumbarton Oaks Park, actually the lower gardens of Beatrice Ferrin and the upper gardens too, are celebrating their centennial year this year. So they've lasted 100 years, right? And it's our job, as Paula says, it's our job to make them last another 100 years. Yay. Yeah. Yay. So that's what we're going to do, damn it. So we need to speak for the ferns. It's our turn. It does have to happen every generation. And we need to plan for the future. So we're talking about endowing Rock Creek Park, just beginning to think about it. We're creating a forest conservation plan together with our partners. And we're thinking about how we can make the forest and the cultural landscapes resilient to climate change so that in 20, 30, 50, 100 years, we still have these amazing treasures and we still have the power of place. Awesome. Awesome. I would just say that it's such an honor to work. It's such an honor to work with the Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy. So thank you so much for everything you guys are doing.
Well, wow. Thank you. That was excellent to have all you guys up here tonight. On behalf of all of us up here this evening, I hope you've gained a sense of wonder and compassion, not just for these ferns, but as we've been talking, for all the living species in the forest and for life on our planet in general. And as I like to say, I hope you've gained a little fern wisdom this evening. We have a little bit of time left to ask questions. If anybody would like to ask a few, I'm going to let Emily take the questions so that it'll just work better that way.
Great. Yes.
I was just wanting to know, where is this lower garden you're talking about? That's the Dumbarton Oaks.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question into the mic so that we can all hear and get it on the recording too. But the question is, where is the lower garden in Dumbarton Oaks?
So there's the Dumbarton Oaks Museum that's on our street. And as you face the museum, there's this long brick wall. As you're facing it, turn right to where the wall stops, and that's actually Lover's Lane. The sign is not there anymore. I guess they had trouble maintaining that sign.
Lover's Lane sign.
Yes, the Lover's Lane sign.
The Dumbarton Park sign is still there.
Yes, that is there, but there used to be a Lover's Lane sign. It is no longer there.
All the sign is there now.
Yeah, there's a very large sign with my face on it. I'm holding up one of the ferns, or maybe the fern is holding me up. Anyway, I don't think that will be there very much longer, but you go down this road. It follows the brick wall, turns down that road, and
So it's closer to the cemetery now?
so you go down between, so there's a park, another park. Oh, is it Montrose Park? Yeah. And so there's the road that divides Montrose Park and Dumbarton Museum. Yeah, and you go down this little lane. There's a national park like bar, and it has a little sign that says Dumbarton Oaks Park. You go down there, and where the brick wall ends, you just take a left, and you go into this park, and that is actually the old farm road into Georgetown. And there's 27 acres. There's a map that I drew of Dumbarton Oaks. The lower 27 acres is on that table over there, and there's a little hiking route you can look at. And there's some of the little features of so what to look for when you go down in there. Anyway.
Yes, go ahead.
I don't want to detract from Rockwick Park and Dumbarton Oaks Park in any way, but there is an extraordinary book that's just come back out published by Milstein on public parks that are being created from disused sites across the country, old railway lines, old drainage pits, old supermarket sites where buildings have been pulled down. And so I think that there is a national movement going on throughout the country, which is really exciting. And what we're doing adds to it. But I think if you can buy the book, it just will enhance the importance of what we're doing and the importance to this country to teach all young, middle-aged, old about the joys of the park.
Great. So, do you know the title of the book?
No, but it's Milstein publisher, and we found it.
Great. So, when we all leave here, we're buying this book that will teach us more about park activism and reclaiming unused spaces. Great. Any other questions? Sure.
I was wondering when you mentioned invasives, I often go for walks with a Botany Society. We go along to these walks on their island. We always point out invasives, garlic mushrooms. Oh, pull that, you see it. Do you encourage people to identify and actually remove invasives when they come across them? So that would be
Great. Yeah, I'm just going to repeat the question to the mic. Do you encourage people to identify and remove the invasives themselves?
Okay. The area where you walk, it's not part of Rock Creek Park. Each park is different and has different regulations. What I can tell you is what we do at Rock Creek Park. We definitely encourage people to ID plants that they see on trail, on formal trails, and technology is helping us for that. There is an app called iNaturalist that we use a lot and we encourage everyone to use, in which you can take a picture, upload it, and it helps you ID different plants. Specifically, it's really good for basic plants. If you're talking about really specific plants, hard plants to ID, that might be an issue. However, in the sense of removal of invasives, unfortunately, people that don't have a formal permit or are not working under one of our friends groups are not permitted to remove invasives. And we do that because we just don't know what the level of expertise of everyone can be. People can think that they are removing something and it can be a native desired species. And that's why we recognize the need for that, and we have created a system in which people can actively attend invasive plant removals taking place at multiple locations throughout the park. Now with the help of the Rock Creek Conservancy, the Dumbarton Oaks Conservancy, that happens at least once a week, if not multiple times a week, multiple times a day. Saturdays it's a really great day for that. You just go to those websites and you can see multiple events happening at a time. So unfortunately not as you walk in, but there are plenty of opportunities for people to assist us with that. Thank you.
If I could just add to that a little bit, Anna, we're very fortunate to have, through the Conservancy, rockcreekconservancy.org, and then you can click on the volunteer tab to find many, many opportunities to come out and remove invasive plants with our team. But we also have a great explainer video on our website that shows how to remove English ivy from trees. And that's probably the most common species of invasive, maybe besides garlic mustard, that people have in their own yards. And you do not need a permit to remove invasive plants in your own yard. You can come to one of our volunteer events and learn some techniques and some identification, but there are also some great resources where you can, I'm sure there are other YouTube videos as well. And really the work that we're doing and that the park is doing and Dumbarton Oaks Park Conservancy is doing will protect the park. And that really is the heart, the lungs, the soul of our region. But we can't fully protect the park unless it has a little buffer around it. So we do need each and every person to take that power of place home with them and make their own little extension of Rock Creek, if you will.
I was intrigued by being reminded that Plummer's Island was imposed upon by the Beltway. But wandering up there a few winters ago, I was struck by something else. And we were all intrigued and admired the fecundity of nature. But if you go under the Beltway there, the fecundity of art is on exhibit. The stanchions and the supports of the Beltway have inspired human beings to create art that is rarely seen. There's no place to see it from except the ground when you wander up through that small wilderness. I recommend it.
It's quite magical. I went 2 weeks ago, or no, last Sunday. I was there on a guided hike under the bridge and looking at Plummer's Island, and it is spectacularly beautiful. And my mom commented, my brother attended the hike also. She's like, even the graffiti was beautiful. It really is. Whoever bothers to get down there does a lovely job, and there's lovely graffiti, but also just this magical, there's a culvert, it's called a channel that separates the island from the mainland, and just the vista is so breathtaking.
You have to give creds for them to do that.
Yeah, and so if the bridge is widened, it will put all that natural, beautiful area under shadow. So all those plants cannot have light. It's quite significant.
I was in Colorado and New Mexico and looking in Rock Creek Park, and I noticed that there must be some kind of policy about leaving downed or felled trees in place. And particularly in Colorado and New Mexico, I saw a fire hazard so big time. And I'm just wondering what the Park Service policy is about that and why.
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. Do you want to repeat the question?
Sure. Yeah, the question was about the policy for fallen or downed trees and plants.
So it's different in different places because there are different climates. So in Rock Creek Park, we allow the down trees and branches that fall to be part of the natural cycle of the forest. So they decompose and then provide more nutrients into the soil for new plants to grow. And we're not a terribly dry region, so we are not
in danger of fire, although that's changing because of climate change. But in some places, we do prescribed burns, where, and we even do them in this region. At Monocacy Battlefield, they've done some prescribed burns recently. And the purpose of those is to burn off that fuel to protect the forest from, flaming, becoming up in flames. But the Park Service in general, what we try to do is have a policy of letting fires burn because there's a fire cycle that's part of nature. But with climate change and all the fires we're having, which is unbelievable. There used to be a fire season. There's no more fire season. All year long is fire season. So they're fighting a lot of the fires now that they otherwise, if there were fewer of them, they would have allowed them to burn. So
you said you had certain things that you could keep fires under control. How would that work?
Well, it's very hard to keep a fire under control, especially in certain climates, like very dry climates or drought areas. So you see so many of these fires in California and in the West, right, in the arid West. So fire specialists, and there are fire scientists that study fire, like our friend studies ferns, and so there are different ways of managing fire for different kinds of fire in different locations. But for prescribed burns, what we're trying to do is remove all of that fuel that you mentioned, from down trees and so forth, so that if there is a fire, it's not as severe, right? And it doesn't catch up and move really fast. So that is one way we control. Another way we control is we build fire lines in forests, so that you might see a forest with a big, huge line down it that's just cleared. And that's to try to keep, if there's a fire on one side, is to try to keep it from jumping to the other side, to stop it in its place. Yeah.
I appreciate that, but I don't think that's worked out in either case that people like blown up. But anyway, thank you.
Okay. Well, I'd love to talk to you more about that afterwards.
Julia, if I may, in addition to that, downwood makes really good habitat for wildlife.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, so looking at that at it from that point, there is a great benefit as well.
Sophia, can I ask you what Dacron is?
Yeah, if Sophia could talk more about the materials for the ferns.
Dacron is the fabric that I make this out of. This Dacron is sourced from Annapolis. I go to a place called Bacon Sales, and they sell junk sales, which is old sails that are discarded. So I'm recycling this fabric. And Dacron is a polyester. It's a man-made fossil fuel product. It's more, old ferns and plant stuff, which is kind of ironic, right? I like these old sails that I use because it's crinkled and it's not perfect, and the ferns are not perfect. And when I put they might just seem all flat and green to you, but to me they look like they have different densities of green in it, and so that's the story of my Dacron. Yeah, it's really tough stuff. That's one thing I have to tell you. That's why they make sails out of them. They're incredibly water resistant, and if you notice, when you usually work with fabric, it frays. This stuff does not fray. It's really, really hard to get this stuff to fray. Incredibly stiff, and it cuts really well with a sharp little scissors. And it's relatively easy to sew with on a sewing machine. Really, really hard to sew through it with your hand. And I did quite a bit of hand sewing on this. I could only do a little at a time because it's incredibly stressful. But yeah, that's the story of Dacron.
I'd just like to recommend to Sophia the artwork of Mary Delaney. Have you seen the collages of Mary Delaney? No. She was I don't know for sure, she was born in England, probably in the 19th or 18th century. And she made collages out of paper that looked incredibly realistic as flowers and plants. And they're in the collection of the British Museum. But if you just Google Mary Delaney, or just, I can get you information. It's fabulous.
Thank you. I'll look into that.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Maybe this is a good time to take a good look at some of the intricate work of the ferns, since we've heard all about the materials. And thank you, Sophia, for bringing the ferns to us and for bringing this wonderful panel of fern experts and conservationists. And thank you all for spending your evening with us. We appreciate you.